Okie dokie. Man, it's bright. Seems unusually bright. It's too late to fix it now. Good evening, Steve. Hope you're doing good. Hope everything's well at the Banner Castle. We're going to get going here in just a second. Give me just a minute. I'm just checking the stuff that I normally do. And we'll get started here. Hey, David, how you doing? Hope everything's good with the various banners this evening. Alrighty. Test. I know y'all can hear me. I'm just trying to gauge an audio level in my software here. 1 2 1 2. Okay, good enough. I'm sure if Bruce was here, he could fix it all to perfection for me, but he's not, so I just kind of roll with what I got. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started then, and I'm just going to monitor things as we go, like I always do. So, my slide is wrong. I see that right off the bat. I forgot to change this. This should be verses 8 through 10. Oh yeah, that's very visible. 8 through 10. And so we're going to finish up this paragraph. Last week was a very difficult passage that has a number of correct interpretations. It still is kind of one of those debated passages to this day. It's one of these passages that kind of has a number of ways to be looked at, and specifically what we're looking at is verse 7 from last week, which is right here. And there's kind of two ways of looking at it. So you have in the days of his flesh, that's simple enough. While he's on earth, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. Okay, very passionate, very sorrowful prayers and petitions to him who's able to save him from death, namely the Father. And he was heard because of his reverence. And so this kind of begs the question, are we implying the Garden of Gethsemane here? Are we talking about Jesus's prayers and supplications in the garden? And if so, why was he not heard and saved from death? The only other good interpretation that I've heard is that we're talking not about he is not praying to be saved from death. He's praying to be resurrected post-death, which doesn't seem to be the Greek wording here. And also, we have no record of that from the Garden of Gethsemane or anywhere else in the Gospel, so it's kind of a you're having to imply extra biblical information that we don't know by making that statement. The other way of interpreting this verse is to say, well, these aren't the prayers to save himself from death. These are just general prayers and supplications to the Father to just generally save humanity, just as a high priestly sense, right? Which would make sense in context, because we're chapter 5, we're dealing with that. We're dealing with that he is the ultimate high priest, and verses 1 through 4 talk about that is the job of the high priest, right? To offer prayers and supplications. That's the exact wording of verses 1 and 2. But then you're like, so why is this here? To him who is able to save him from death. Is the prayer directed because he wanted to be saved from death in some way? This entire phrase just kind of goes out the door if you take that interpretation. Why is this necessary? Why does he need to imply that the one who saved him, or the one who can or cannot save her from death, was the one that he prayed these supplications to? Now that would make sense because he was heard, right? We know that the request and the prayers of Christ on a high priestly sense on our behalf are heard because he is righteous, he is good, he is reverent, right? but then it just kind of says, well, why is this here? So, admittedly, this is a difficult verse, and there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. And it is something that you also look at the remainder of this paragraph, which is what we're going to look at tonight, and you can see even the last 3 verses are just about as big as the one verse by itself, because it kind of adds some context to it, but it still leaves some room that is in some part unexplainable. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. This is the ESV here. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a priest right after the order of Melchizedek. And there's our man Melchizedek again. So there is no easy interpretation here. I tend to lean towards the latter, as you can imagine. I think this is not a specific prayer or supplication to be saved from death or to be resurrected, such as the interpretation of a lot of prominent theologians. I don't think that makes sense in the Gospels. I don't think that makes sense in the Greek here. But I admit freely that that doesn't make a lot of sense of this phrase right here. Why is it necessary? Why did the author include that he could save him from death in this passage, if it's just extra? So let's look at verses 8 through 10 here. We'll see some different understandings of the context. We might revisit verse 7 with some of this understood, but we still have some problems here that don't make a lot of sense. By far the biggest one is the first verse, verse 8, which I know I messed up, but verse 8 is right here. So you got verse 8, you got verse 9, and then verse 10. So although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. Okay, here's a God who learns, in itself the first problem, and being made perfect, right, as though God needs to be perfected in some way. That's a little lesser to a degree. And then, of course, verse 10 makes the most sense. We already know that he is designated as the Greek interpretation here. I'm going to highlight that as we go. So let's translate verse 8 here and see what we can understand about it. Now, this word right here at the very beginning, you'll probably note most of the time when you see the kai, K-A-I, it's and or also, or something like, a general connector. But you'll notice this is kai-per, P-E-R on the end. So this is like even though, or above and, is kind of the very wood understanding. In spite of this, even though this, even because of this. So I'm going to translate this even though, and I'm going to explain in just a second why. Find my mouse. Even though which being, excuse me, this is being, this is the to be verb in Greek, being son, uios, U-I-O-S, son. And you have this kind of interesting phrase, emathen aphon epathen. And this kind of does rhyme, and there's a reason for that. So, emathen, he learned, these are very similar, off, A-P-H there, from, on, which, hepathen, he suffered. He learned from which he suffered. And you have those last 2 words here in the end there, which I'm going to bump down to the next line. These last, tain, the, hupa, kohen, the obedience, or submission. I'm going to go with obedience. I'm going to explain why as we go. So even though being son, he learned from which he suffered the obedience. He learned obedience from which he suffered. So, before we get into the learning aspect here, this is an interesting phrase in and of itself, and there's a reason. This word right here is kind of unusual. Kaper. In spite of being son is kind of the donation there. So I don't want us to skip over this. This is important. This is not just a connector here. This is actually kind of supposed to be like a incredulous connector. It's just like, even in spite of being a son, even though he is a son, even to the crazy degree that he was a son, something else. And so this is kind of supposed to be like over the top, over and above, superlative. You can see this is, so in Greek this is a nominative right here, so that just tells us this is the subject of the sentence. And so it denotes there's an emphasis on his sonship as opposed to other sons. That's kind of interesting. Even though he is the Son, even crazy as it would be that he is Son, he learned through his obedience. So this is kind of supposed to be a phrase that is over the top. One commentator says this. He says, the Son's path to priesthood passed through suffering. From the standpoint of his divine identity, his suffering is incongruous and concessive, although he was a son, as the concessive, although he was a son, shows. So for human sons and daughters, the many sons whom God is bringing to glory, suffering is to be expected as a sign of our legitimacy in the faith. But it is shocking that the unique Son, who is the radiance of God's glory, would suffer and learn obedience through that suffering. So there is an essence of the author trying to communicate even this Son is not exempt from suffering and learning obedience as a result of it. Like even among the other sons, even given that the other sons also experience suffering and obedience through suffering. We're going to get into that in just a minute. One more commentator says, son though he was, not son though he was, not son though he was. And there is the only difference there is you see the capital there. The writer knows that the painful discipline is to be expected by all who are sons of God the Father. He points out in 12:5 that every son, because he is a son, has to suffer. But here the remarkable thing is that Jesus had to suffer, not because but although he was weos, the son, which shows that Jesus is a son in a unique sense. As applied to Jesus, weos means something special. At the divine weos, in the sense of verse 1:1, it might have been expected that he would be exempt from such a discipline. So the author knows what he's doing, is my point. In verse 8, he is aware that there is a sense of like, oh wow, even this son experiences the same thing that all the other sons do, which is suffering and obedience through suffering, which is our problem, right? This phrase right here, emathen off hon hepathen. And it rhymes, and there's actually, as a fun side note, this really has no bearing on our interpretation, but there's a couple of Greek scholars that point out that Plato used this. That in extra biblical Platonic writings, there's a couple sections where Plato says man learns through suffering. I don't think that's in the Republic, but I believe that's in some other just extraneous writing that he does. And even the pagan Greeks understood suffering changes the man. Suffering makes you who you are in a real sense. And as sadistic as that sounds, consider the truth of the fact that you are in many ways formulated through your experiences, and you would probably also, you may know this experientially better than I could explain it logically, that in a lot of cases it's the difficult and painful and suffering experiences that define and create a major part of who you become and kind of mold you in a real way. And even the pagan Greeks understood this, and Plato understood this, and so he kind of coined this phrase, and it rhymes, and it's kind of supposed to be like a little poetic phrase here. And so there's some Greek scholars that make the argument that say the writer of Hebrews was familiar with Plato, and he kind of took a common phrase, which, interestingly, side note, which kind of adds to the pot. If you were on the scale of like, was Paul the one who wrote Hebrews or not, it kind of adds a coin to the side of Paul, because Paul does this in other gospels, or not gospels, Paul does this in other epistles where he quotes just kind of pithy Greek sayings and incorporates them into his inspired writings. Bad company corrupts good morals. I think that's 1 Corinthians 10, I want to say. And that was just kind of a common Greek saying, a Platonic saying on top of that, but it is technically true, even from a biblical standpoint. And so this is kind of one of those. He learned through which he suffered. So the real obvious quandary is, well, even if you want to make that argument, this makes sense to us as believers, right? You could make a great case that every believer learns through their sufferings. But how do you apply that to God is the difficult question, and it is supposed to be kind of superlative. Even though he was the Son, the one and only divine Son, he learned through suffering. So, the first thing I want to make an argument for is that the difficulty here, there's a couple difficulties that need to make sense, and the first thing that comes to our mind is, well, God doesn't learn, right? There's no sense in which God gains new information like we do. He has all information at all times. He has all correct and hypothetical information at any given time, right? There's no sense in which God is losing information. So how can you say Jesus learns through suffering? Well, consider, and this is kind of part of hopefully our theology, God, just to say God is infinite, and to say, let's put it further, to say God is omniscient does not imply that he will experience every possible experience. It is not wrong to say, even though our God is infinite and omniscient and omnipotent and omnipresent, in spite of those things, there are certain things that will never enter into the experience of God. There are things that God will never experience. There are things that God will never experientially in his personhood feel. And for example, sin, right? It is not wrong to say, yes, God is infinite, but he will never have personal experience of sin, right? God will never sin. There's no sins ever where God will know what it is to feel greed or selfishness or anger or, well, not anger, but a self-righteous hatred, let's say, or something along those lines. There's never a case where, even though God is infinite, God cannot experience evil in his person, is what I'm saying. Now, obviously, all kinds of evil can be done to God, and all kinds of evil is done to God, and that is a separate and different experience than he himself experiencing evil, and that does not in any way exclude his infinity, right? In no way are we jeopardizing his infinity by saying that. Another thing you could say is God cannot experience failure. I know this is a little more Calvinistic, but God's plans will not fail, ever. Right? There's never a sense in when God will say, oh no, my plan didn't work, and be depressed because his plan didn't work. It's never going to happen. I've seen some guys, you might be able to make an argument that maybe like in Jesus' human lifetime, he failed at making a table or playing a ball game or something like that. Okay, if you want to go down that road, but there's never an ultimate sense in which God's plans will fail, right? God is not going to experience failure, ever. So, I just want to correct our definition of infinity to start with. Yes, God is infinite, but it is not wrong to say there are things that are outside of God that he will never and cannot ever personally have in his person. That is not a wrong of infinity to say. So, with that being said, what would we make an argument for that Jesus, the Son, specifically the Son, learned through his suffering? Well, first I want to look at it from a human standpoint, because bear in mind, one of the major themes of chapter 5 is your high priest is like you, right? He is similar to you. That's the purpose. That's why he's a high priest. He has to be like you in every respect, right? It's Hebrews 2, made like his brothers. So, humans, so in what sense would we say this is something that humans experience? And I had a fantastic conversation with some friends of mine not too long ago on the subject of human suffering, and it kind of boils down to how do we experience it, and then how does Jesus experience it by proxy, or personally, not by proxy. But it was kind of that whole debate about why do humans suffer if God is good, right? If God is good, how can humans experience suffering? How can there be evil and pain and death and hatred in the world if a good God rules over it? And how would he, if he is infinite and if he is sovereign and if he's in control of all things, why would he not just eliminate those things and still create a worshiping creation, right? We know it's very possible that God could create a universe and a version of humanity in where pain and suffering and death do not exist ever, and they still worship him and love him, and he receives full and total worship and service from all human beings. God could create that, right? He could create a correct, if you will, Eden, right, where humanity does not sin and they multiply and they worship and serve him and they have no experience of good or evil whatsoever. It is true that God has the capacity and the knowledge, and it could create such a universe. He's infinite, and he's infinite in every way. But consider what is different between Eden and Revelation. There is a sense in which humanity has dynamically changed between Eden and Revelation, and they are not the same creatures. Job is the best example. Satan in Job 1 says, yeah, he worships you because he's never had reason not to. Right? That's Satan's accusation, right? Job worships you and he loves you because he has no reason not to, right? You've given him all this stuff and you take care of him, but the second you hurt him, that's going to change. The significance of Revelation is that there will be a people that have suffered and have endured pain and hatred and suffering and death, and they still worship God. That is something Adam and Eve have no context for, or at least pre-garden or pre-fall, right? There's a significant change there. And so, pagans though they were, the Greeks understood suffering dynamically changes the human soul. And there's a significant refining that happens to the human soul, which Paul makes clear in 1 Corinthians 3, right? That you're refined through the fire, right? In a very real sense, human souls are drastically altered because of what they experience. And you can make an argument, yeah, sure, God could make a garden full of human beings that worship him and love him and serve him and never experience pain, death, or suffering or evil. But the second you hurt them, right, or you take that away, will they still worship you? And so there's a sense in which human beings experience suffering and they come out perfected creatures, not innocent creatures, because they still experience all the things that sin brings about and its consequences. And the hypothetical thing that God may not save you from pain or suffering or death, and God may fully allow certain pains and sufferings and deaths to happen to you, and even in spite of that, through the Holy Spirit sanctifying you, you will still worship God. And hopefully you see there's an incredible beauty to that. So, the same with Christ. Consider this. Never, and I know we're dealing with infinite God here, but consider, never before in eternity was there a sense in which the Son obeyed the Father perfectly and did not experience the love and joy of the Father in return. This was a new experience for the Son. This had never happened pre-crucifixion, where the Son did everything the Father required. He obeyed the Father. He serves the Father. He loves the Father. He does everything according to his Father's wishes, and the Father forsakes him on the cross. That had never happened in history pre-crucifixion, right? And he remains obedient anyway, right? The Father does not reward his obedience. The Father does not pour out, post-resurrection he does, but in that time and place, Jesus does not experience the love and the joy and the honor and glorification of the Father, even though he obeys to the letter all the way to the cross and death. That was something that had not happened in all of eternity, right? That was a new thing. That was like the incarnation. God becoming man was a brand new event that God, or the Son of God, and any member of the Godhood had not experienced up to that point. So, there is a new experience that God himself, as Christ, experienced when the Father did not reciprocate love and life to him, even though he was obedient all the way to death. So, in that sense, Jesus knew he was called to obey, he was called to suffer, he was called to endure pain and punishment, and was still obedient anyway. That was something that the Son had not processed before, if you will. Now, we can say all these things, and you could say, well, yes, but he knew what that meant. And sure, yeah, we can play that one all the way out. Sure, the Father knows what sin is, and the Son knew what was going to happen. There's no sense in which information was hidden or constrained in any way by saying these objects. By making this assumption, we are in no way saying that he didn't know exactly this was going to happen. He didn't know all the implications. He didn't know all the motivations. He didn't know all the emotions that were going to happen as a result of that. He didn't know all the ramifications that were going to happen for all eternity. He knew all that information. He knew all these things were going to happen. He knew the exact emotional, spiritual, and mental ramifications of each one, and without personally experiencing them. And so I guess, the bottom line is, I guess, you would make an argument, there is a difference in infinity between experience and knowledge. And so God can know all things without experiencing all things. And so here was a new experience, which dynamically was a new experience for the Son of God. That never before had Christ had to be obedient, even when the Father did not honor and love him in that moment for him. Which, as a side note, that makes his cry on the cross that much more significant, right? Lama, lama, uh, lama. No, I messed it up in Aramaic, but Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? Right? That was why that cry is so significant. That had never happened before, where he was perfectly obedient all the way down to the final nail in the cross, and he still was not loved by the Father at that moment. He still just experienced wrath and forsaking, and that's why that was a new experience that we should take, not just from a human standpoint, from an eternal standpoint. The Son of God, the Son who is God, had never cried out to the Father who is God before, "You forsook me even though I was good." Right? So, that was a new experience for God, if we dare say something so controversial. And in that sense, so the understanding is he learned from which he suffered the obedience. So there is a real sense in which God experienced a new experience that was not party to the Son previous to this time, and it was something that brought about an obedience in him even when he suffered as a result. The Son had never suffered because of his obedience before. One commentator puts it this way. He says, our passage emphasizes that it was in the midst of pain and struggle and the shadow of death that Jesus learned obedience. Two episodes especially come to mind. First is anguish in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he anticipated the wrath of God on the cross, and second, his death by crucifixion. In the garden, Jesus prayed with tears and great anguish. My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. He said to the disciples, great was his struggle on that dreadful night. He fell on his face and prayed. In the context of the greatest dread imaginable, Jesus prayed, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. This was reverent submission like no other, and for it God received Jesus as our high priest. So this is interesting because this adds a whole other layer, and we see this supported by verses 9 and 10, right? It was because of this obedience and this experience that the Son endures that he had not endured previous to being incarnated. Because of that, he can now be the high priest. This was a necessary requirement for priesthood, if you will, that he experienced this experience of obedience even when it hurts, obedience even when it's difficult, obedience even to the greatest extent of pain and suffering imaginable, and not being loved by God in that moment for it. And that is what qualified him to be a high priest. So, my point is, the object is not that Jesus did not know these things would happen. He knew full well all the implications, all the motivations, all the emotional upheaval that was going to come with it. He was fully aware of all those things, but he did not experience them, and was thus formulated into the high priest because of his obedience. And so that's the understanding of his learning here, which is the last word of this verse. He learned from which he suffered the obedience. Hupakoen. I want to do something a little bit different here. I know you all are very familiar with this word. Sorry, I'm skipping through a bunch of slides, or I'm looking at a specific slide here. This is our word obedience. Y'all are probably pretty familiar with this. This is hupakuo. In Greek, I'll try and write it here. You probably have already seen this in previous Bible studies. Hupa. And then the omega on the end. Hupa kuo, which is under hearing. If I were to put an A here, this word right here would be I hear. Akuo is I hear. Hupa kuo, it turns into an O when it's attached to a word, is under hearing. So it's like you heard something and you obey. Right? We looked at this in Colossians. We looked at this in Ephesians pretty significantly. This is the whole passage where we looked at that in Ephesians. Children, obey your parents. That's that word right here. Hupakuo. It's a verb, and it means like the strict like obedience, right? There is a word for submission that is used in the husband and wife context, and it's a very different word. Even if it has a lot of the same implications or not. But this word is like soldierly strict like obedience. That's what this word means. It means absolution. It's like something you assign to a servant or a child, right? You tell your kids to obey strictly, right? You tell your servants to obey strictly. They hear a command and they obey instantaneously, theoretically. But you know what I'm saying. That's the understanding of this word. It's like a strict, something you would command a soldier to do. This winds in the sea obey instantaneously, Matthew 8:27. Right? There's no, they are submissive to him, but when he issues a direct order, they cease. So this word has a very strict connotation, is the understanding. This is like you hear a command and you immediately obey. Now, I want to do something kind of interesting here. I want to show you a lexicon entry. Lexicon is a ancient Greek dictionary. This is from the Abbott Smith lexicon. And so what we have here is an entry. I want to explain this, even if just for pure academic purposes. I want to show you kind of how Greek parsing is done in the text. So this is all the information that scholars can find on this word. And I'm talking, when I say all the information scholars can find, every bit of information about this word that you can know from ancient Greece or any context in which Koine Greek was spoken can be found in this little article right here. I'm going to show you. So I really highly encourage you to use lexicons and find lexicons, and especially for like keywords. You know, not necessarily every word, but if there's this key Greek word, by all means, please use a lexicon. You'll find it very helpful. Here's a great example. So this is the word hupakue. Remember, we'll go back up here. There is a verb form of this, hupakuo, with an O on the end that I wrote in a second ago. There's a U-O there. This is A-N on the end. Ada nu on the very end here. This is the noun. Okay, so the verb is I obey. This is obedience. This is just a noun. The idea of obedience, the concept of obedience, okay? So, bear in mind, let's look at this little, I want to just show you this little lexical entry here. So, hupakue, this is straight out of a lexicon from hupakuo, right? There's your little greater than sign. Hupakuo, there's the verb, right? So, it's saying this is the noun of this verb. And then he actually cites all the uses of the word that exist. So in the LXX, all right, here we go. This is great. The noun form, not the verb, the noun, you can find in the LXX, in the Greek Old Testament in 2 Samuel 22:36. I'm not going to look all these up, but just for reference, all the information about anything you'd want to know about this word is here. He even gives you the Strong's number for it. If you want to go look up the Strong's number. This is an AQ. This is an abbreviation for Aquila. There's a letter to Aquila. This is just basically in brackets here. He's got extra biblical literature. If you want to look this word up in extra biblical sources outside of Scripture, you can look in the LXX, and one is found one time in the LXX, is found one time in a letter to Aquila, where he cites 2 Samuel 23:23. So in the letter to Aquila, he cites this section. And then you see the definition, obedience. Right? This is just obedience. Very simple. Opposed to parakoe. Parakoe is disobedience, rebellion, right? The opposite of hupakue. You don't put yourself under something. Parakoe is, para is actually, if I were divided up the same way in Greek, I'm trying to finagle my Greek here. Parakuo is not under, I put myself under what I hear. This is, I push away from what I hear. Para is away from. Like you push against something, you push away, you're leaving something. So I get away from what I hear. So it's rebellion, it's disobedience. So as opposed, it's the opposite of this word. Then he offers you his definitions. So he's got 3 uses of this word, hupakue. In general, absolute. Okay, just absolute obedience. And he cites all the uses of the word. Okay, and he's found in Romans. You can find it in 2 Corinthians. The genitive, subjunctive. That's what this is. Just Greek technicalities here. You can find it in Philemon 1:21. You can find it as the general object in Romans 1:5. Basically, he cites all the uses that you can find hupakue as a general absolute. When he's just, in general, the epistles talk about, strict obedience as a noun, just as is. Here's all its uses. Or, here we go, you can find some nuance of obedience to God's commands, absolute. Okay, so not just general obedience to general ideas, but a specific obedience, right? 1 Peter 1:2. Opposed to hamartia, sin, Romans 6:16, right? That's the passage, right? Whoever you're obedient to, that which you submit yourself to obedience, you become a slave to. That's that famous passage. Tekna hupakues, child obedience, 1 Peter 1:14. General subject, Romans 15 and 16. So he just kind of cites all the uses here. And then finally, here's our big one. Look here at the last definition of Christ's obedience. That is a key one here. Look at what we have. Absolute Hebrews 5:8. And also apparently 5:19, which I looked up and I was like, what's the other usage of hupakue, obedience, in which Christ's obedience is being discussed? And I have it here. Therefore, as one trespass led to condemnation for all men, so one act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all men. For as by one man's disobedience, right, parakue, the many were made sinners, so by one man's obedience, the many were made righteous. So here we go. Basically, all that to say, this lexicon entry is very helpful in showing me, okay, here's every use of the word of Christ's, of the obedience in reference to Christ. When a Christ was obedient, and it had obedience, the hupakue assigned to him, and it's used twice. Hebrews 5:8 and Romans 5:19. And then, just for our purposes, the Abbott Smith lexicon includes the word is not found except in the LXX, New Testament, and ecclesiastical literature. There's a little dagger right here. So what that means is, and if you look this up in a lexicon, that means there's no more uses. This is it. All the uses of this word are right here. All of them. You can find an LXX in the New Testament that's cited right here, and the one ecclesiastical work, which is Aquila. That's it. You'll find it in no Platonic works. You'll find it in none of the works of Aristotle or Pythagoras or any of those guys. You can only find it in Scripture, the LXX, and in the Aquila letter. That's it. That's the only uses. That's what this little all-inclusive dagger means. So, I hope this is helpful. I want to show, this is the technical Greek cross-referencing, that this is the highest level of Greek you can do. This is what the grammarians do, and they sit down and they study all the, and they go and they open each of these references and they kind of cross-reference stuff. But this is why a lexicon is so valuable, and this is why it gives us a lot of insight into how this word is used, and it specifically directs our attention to how to use this word, right? Hebrews 5:8 and 5:19. What's the deal of Christ's obedience in 5:19? Right? You have it immediately juxtaposed to Adam, right? We're dealing with federal headship now. There is one man who's disobedient, directly defied the orders of the God the Father, right? To the letter. Was told not to eat the apple, immediately eats the apple, or does precisely what he knows he is told not to do. And then, as opposed to that, then as a paradox, as a juxtaposition, you see one man's obedience, the many are made righteous, right? So you got it's supposed to be a sense of contrast. So the opposite of everything Adam is defined by in the fall. So hopefully this gives us a sense in which this obedience, yes, it's strict, but it is absolute, right? There's never a point where Christ disobeyed the Father, even to the point when he was in the middle of all this suffering, right? There is a unique experience to obedience that he now has that he did not have previous to the crucifixion. Up until the crucifixion, Christ was absolutely obedient, and he never suffered. As a result of that, he was rewarded and glorified by his Father for his obedience. But here was the first time he learned what it was, if you will, I use the term learning loosely, to be obedient even in suffering, right? That was a unique and new experience for the Son of God. And not only does that make him like his brothers in every respect, right, in Hebrews 2, although we deserve it, that is a distinct point of difference, right? We are people who are not like Christ in that we suffer for justification. We suffer because we brought, in many cases, are suffering our own consequences. But nevertheless, he experiences all the experiences that his brothers experience, and that qualifies him to be a high priest. So, hopefully that makes sense of this word. And to that end, you could come back here to verse 7. You could say, well, that definitely seems, Alex, as though that is implying that we're talking about when Jesus offers up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. That sounds a lot like suffering to me. We must be talking about his death, either immediately in the Garden of Gethsemane or the crucifixion immediately after. I mean, it could be. That could be. That still doesn't remove any of your other problems. So I know there's a lot of people that make this argument and say, well, verse 8 seems to point to the fact that verse 7 is talking specifically about his sufferings on the cross and right before the cross. But again, you still have this problem of, well, if that is the case, then he didn't pray to be saved to be resurrected. He prayed in the passage is saying to be saved from death, and he was heard because of his reverence, which would mean he was not heard if he was praying to save from death. So the same problem we talked about in verse 7 still exists, but I would see where, and I could absolutely concur, that there seems to be more context for the late life crucifixion period that we're talking about here. So, I hope that's about as clear as mud. It makes perfect sense. And if it doesn't make perfect sense, trust me, it doesn't necessarily to me or to everybody else either. But that at least provides us some greater backdrop into what learning through suffering means in Christ's specific case. So, that being said, I want to look at verse 9 and 10. I want to try and finish these up. I'm going to be as quick as I can. These will not take quite as long because these are not quite as involved. And teleotheis, and being perfected or being made perfect. Being perfected. That's fine. Ageneto, made. That's just the verb to make, but in past tense. So this is past tense, being made perfect. This would be the interpretation here. Pasin, all. It's universal. Tois, the. Hupakuusin. This is a participle. You probably see our hupakuo here in the middle of that word. That is correct. This is obedience, but this is a participle, so it's a noun form. So this would be the obedient ones. The ones who are obedient. The obedient ones would be the easiest translation here. Alto, to him. You have this last little phrase. Aitios, cause. Soterios, salvation. Ioniu, literally to the ages, or this is the Greek way of saying eternity, or eternal, forever. Unto the ages, for all the ages, forever. So, and being perfect, so we got a couple, let's break this down by phrase. Being made perfect, all the obedient ones to him, cause salvation eternal. What does that mean? Well, right out the gate, you have being made perfect. Now, you probably already guess the understanding here. Are we saying that there's a sense in which God was not perfect? No, not inherently. But we are saying that there is an aspect of his priesthood that had yet to be made perfect. And you can see this by this word teleos right here. If you're familiar with the teleos, the teleological, if you ever heard that in like philosophy class, something that's teleological, which means the ends, the ultimate right or the ultimate perfection is the end of something. That's getting into, theology 101 or philosophy 101. But it's used to mean like the completion, the end. It's used a lot to say like teleological ethics, like the ends justify the means, which, whether or not you believe in that. But it means something at the end, something at the finality. So it's not necessarily, my point is, it's not necessarily a perfection of good or moral character. It's saying something's completed. This Greek word here, teleos, doesn't necessarily mean you are being morally perfected or that you are spiritually more or less perfect than you were previously. This is saying something's completed. He was finished, to put it roughly. He was completed. He was fully finished out and completed at that point, right? Which we know to be the case of the high priest. Regardless of his nature and his perfect character, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, right? So that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. There was a sense in which he had to be made like something that he was not previously. He was not like his brothers previous to this point. So now that's been made perfect, or that's been finished. That's not, so if you want to say in English, perfect is maybe not the correct word to use in English, even though, that may just be getting into semantics. But after being completed, you might be able to argue his priesthood was finished. He is now 100% fully qualified to be the high priest forever at this point, at post-resurrection. He has endured everything that a human being endures in every respect. It's total. It's complete at that point. So this is not a perfection of character. This is not saying he had to be made perfect in nature or character. It's saying he had to be made perfect in priesthood, right, in his work, so that once he is made like his brothers, right? Made being something that happened previous. Now he might become the merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God. So his work was made perfect. And then there is kind of an irony, and there should be, in that so he's obedient in verse 8, right? Because of his obedience, or he learns because of his obedience, and now the obedient ones to him cause salvation eternal. So now we're the obedient ones. So he was obedient to the point of death on the cross. He suffered and was obedient even in spite of all his suffering. And now there is kind of an irony in that the tables are turned in verse 9. And so now we are obedient to the one who was obedient. And we are the obedient ones here. So he is referring all the obedient ones, all the ones obedient to him, the cause of salvation eternal. And I am supplying, to smooth this out in English, a definite article here. The cause, so he is the cause of salvation eternal. That's the understanding of this particular word. So there is kind of an irony that Christ was obedient, and now we who are obedient receive the cause of salvation eternal, right? Which is not us. This word right here is perhaps the most unusual. Aitios, I think it is used very little. I should have written it down here somewhere. It's only used 4 times. That's right. So it's a very rare word. In the Greek New Testament, it's only used 4 times. Literally means the cause. And every other use of it is in Luke 23. It's used once here in Hebrews 5:8, which I messed up at the top of the slide. But the other 3 uses are found in Luke 23, and all of them are in reference to the cause to crucify Jesus, the cause to destroy Christ, and they're used by Pilate. And all the other 3 cases are used by Pontius Pilate. So I find no cause in this man, Pilate says. There's no guilt. There's no reason in this man for me to punish him, right? There's no cause that I should punish him. And then in Luke 4, in verse 14, he reiterates the same thing. So this is significant. We'll get to this in Matthew, how Pilate tried 3 times. There is a significance to that. I did not find this man guilty of any of the causes against him, of any of your causes against him. None of your causes held up. And the 3rd time he said, why? What evil has he done? I found in him no cause. Now you say, well, yes, Alex, but it's translated guilt twice. It charges as once. That's true. This is the only positive rendering of this word. This is the only time this word is rendered in a positive sense, that the cause, Jesus is now the cause of salvation. He is the one who he's the one you could charge, if you want to use that terminology, with bringing about eternal salvation, so to speak. So this tells us that he can, I think it's the ESV that says he is the source of life. That translates this wherever I put it. Here it is. Atios instead of cause, they say source of salvation eternal. Sure, that works. That's a good translation, but I think that takes away from the gravity of, like, you're almost accusing him of something. In this case, positively. He now stands as the one person responsible for salvation eternal, right? He is directly responsible for it. He made it happen. He deliberately made it happen, and you could charge him with saving people, almost, so to speak. It's kind of got this almost, not so much the source, as though he's capable of it, which he is, but almost as though he deliberately and intentionally became, this was charged to him, right? He became the reason for it happening because he wanted it to be that way. So there's a little bit of nuance there that's kind of hidden otherwise. Okay, I'm going to do verse 10 very quickly, because I want to move to the next paragraph next time. I'm going to go under here. Nope, that's not going to fit. Come on now. So, he's the cause of salvation eternal. Big old word right here out the gate. Pros agoruthes. Pros agoruthes. I'm going to translate this: having been proclaimed, addressed. I think the ESV says. Under the God, arche erius. I'm going to make this a little smaller. I know I fuss with this text every time. Just bear with me. Under the God, arche erius, high priest, archpriest, kata, according to tain toxin Melchizedek. And you see that capital in there. The order, or system, Melchizedek. That's the proper name that's capitalized there. Interestingly, in Greek, it's spelled without the Z. Greeks don't. There's no Z in Greek, or at least it is not used here. It's a sigma, Melchizedek. So, having been proclaimed under God, high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, again, I'm going to fold on Melchizedek. I'm not going to get into a great deal of Melchizedek right now. You're going to be sick and tired of hearing the name Melchizedek by the time we get to chapter 7. But for our purposes here, if you want to keyword this, our big old verb right here, massive perfect tense verb, under the god Archerius, which I know this is a keyword, but we've gone through it pretty extensively before, and of course the order of Melchizedek. So those would be pretty much our keywords that drive the interpretation here. So the only one that I want to spend some time on, I'm rushing because I want to get this done, is this verb, this big old verb right here, which is a compound verb, pros argeriu, means something, and theis is just the suffix that just tells me, or tells any Greek grammarian, this is a perfect participle. So this means a perfect passive. Excuse me, not a participle. So this is action that has been done in the past that has reference and effects that still bear into the present. That's all that a perfect means. It's a different type of past tense in Greek. And so pros is to or towards. Argerio is to address, to speak. So this word kind of means to speak towards something, to speak to a topic of some sort. I want to do this one more time. This is much quicker though. Here's the other lexicon entry. And you can see he's divided up. It's a compound. Pros argereu. It's found one time in the LXX. Here's your Hebrew Strong's number. It's found in Ezra. Here's your Strong's number for the cognate. It's found in all these places in the LXX. Or I'm sorry, this is extra biblical literature. You got the Wisdoms, the Maccabees, lots of the Maccabees. To address, he defines it to greet, salute, to call by name, address, or style something. And then he gives you accusative, passive, Hebrews 5:10. And then there's that dagger there, which means it tells us this is all the uses of it. There's no other uses of this word in any other Greek sources, scripture or otherwise, that we have except what you find right here in this lexicon, which is all these uses in the extra biblical Maccabees literature, once in Ezra, once in Deuteronomy, cognate words, and then Hebrews 5:10. That's it. So we don't have a lot of information to draw this from, but if you read through the Maccabees uses of it, which I did not do, but I looked at some of these other verses, and using this lexical entry here, we can see it kind of means like to salute in a sense. There's a sense in which this is like a heralding, like an address, if you would, like a political or royal address, right? This is like a herald reads off a proclamation. You're called by a specific address. This is like formality, if you will. And so the understanding is here that something happened. I'm going to go all the way back up to the top. Because of this, because of what he endured here, because he acted like a high priest. This is my interpretation of verse 7, so bear with me. If you interpreted verse 7 according to Alex's interpretation, he acts like a high priest, right? He offers prayers and supplications, and he's heard because he's reverent. Then he learns obedience because he suffered like all his brothers. Then he's made into that perfect role, right? Because it becomes salvation because of all these things. And you come all the way down to verse 10. Then God the Father proclaims him high priest. So he acts like a high priest here. He endures his similarity, let's say, his identity. He identifies with his subjects here. And then he is made perfect for the role here. Then God proclaims him that title here. So you almost see there's a progression, right? He has the nature of it. He endures the identity of it. He is perfected for that role through his work. And then finally he does the work for it. And then finally he is awarded that title. That's the rough way I'm going to put it right now, for lack of a better term. God heralds and proclaims, you are the high priest. You did this, this, and this. Or you are this, and you did these things. And now you are the high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So I think that also stands to interpretation. You see the kind of progression through this section. And you see the same thing that we saw in verses of Hebrews 1 through 4. Right? Go back and look at Hebrews 5, 1 through 4. And it talks about this is what a high priest does. This is what a high priest is. This is his general demeanor and attitude. And this is how he is selected. And then here in verses 7 and 10, on the other side of the Isaiah quotations, you have the same stuff. This is what Jesus is. This is what Jesus endured. This is what he did. And because of that, then he is awarded, if you will. Or he is glorified, I should say, as a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So this is kind of a mirror paragraph to that. So, and then Melchizedek, we'll get into another time. So, I want to go ahead and close here. I know I kind of rushed at the end there, but hopefully this makes sense of this difficult passage, even if it doesn't answer every question. I know there's still some other interpretations that float around this passage, and it is difficult. But hopefully this at least gives us a real sense of the work of Christ, the nature of Christ, and really, if nothing else, the experience of the learning, if you will. And I use that term or I choose this term specifically. He experienced the learning. This is not as though he gained or lost new information that he didn't otherwise have in terms of what was going to the implications, the emotions, the motivations that were all wrapped into what he knew full well was going to happen. But the actual experience of it was a new thing for God to experience. And he could be infinite and that still not be incongruent with his infinity. And then finally, this makes him the direct cause of salvation, right? His righteousness, his priestly intercession, his sacrifice being the only possible mode of saving sinners. So, I'm going to go ahead and close there. I know this is a lot. There's a lot of details here. I kind of wanted to show you some of the more technical Greek and lexical studies that is done, especially in words like these that are kind of a little more rare. Hopefully that was at least insightful. And next week we'll start the new paragraph, and we're almost at the end of chapter 5, and I think there's one more paragraph, and then we get into chapter 6, which is kind of changes tones and subjects a little bit. So yeah, this has been good for me. I hope it's been good for you. I'm going to go ahead and pray. Again, leave me any questions or comments or thoughts you have in the chat, and I'll be glad to read them and talk about them. I'm more than happy to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and pray, and otherwise we'll be done. Father, we come before you and we praise you for being a God who ordained and predestined since eternity past for your Son to experience suffering so that we could be free and saved creatures. And I praise you for these things. And I pray, Lord, that we would be mindful and grateful for what you endured in Gethsemane, on the cross, and through the death and resurrection of your Son that made possible the cause of our salvation. And I praise you for the depth of our understanding that we can have of your Son's suffering, of your Son's obedience, and all the things that we suffer and also obey as a result of that. And I pray that this would be a meaningful understanding that we can take into our daily lives on suffering and how we are still called to glorify and be obedient in spite of all these things. And I pray this in Christ's most holy name. Amen. Thank you, guys. Hope you have a great night. You're welcome, Deva. Hope everything goes well with you guys for the rest of the week. And we'll see you Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.